Hello, welcome back to this China in Africa debates. My name is Geraud Neema. I'm the Africa editor of the China Global South Project. So for this week, I was planning to wait a bit longer to make this video because I was expecting that this week we're going to have much more detailed data about China trade numbers, because earlier this week the China Custom released the report of 2024 showing the numbers of China trade around the world. So the overall numbers is around $6 trillion, with 3 trillion in terms of China export to the world and 2 trillion of China import from the world. Basically, China made a trade surplus of $1.7 trillion. I'm going to put the link so you can see the reports and the press release of China's custom service, so you can understand the details number of it. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing much more on China-Africa trade. Last year, I made a similar video because we had numbers about the top, about countries and region. Basically, we could see how much China traded with different African countries and Africa in general, but with also different African countries. We could see what was the top 5 countries, what were the top bottom countries, what was the main trade partners of China on the continent. For this week, they released the data. They released it in Chinese, not in English yet. We're still waiting for the data to be released in English. But even in Chinese one, when they release it, it's regional and some big countries, but not breakdown of every countries like they did before. They're gonna do that later on, and when they're gonna do, I'm gonna make a video kind of looking into China-Africa trade in terms of country by country, the top 5, what was different from last year, what to look for, and what to pay attention to. So for this video, I'm just going to be focusing on one specific country, because that specific country has been highlighted just in different reports that China has been doing in the last year, in the last years. When they talk about Africa, they say among those countries, they say, for example, South Africa. South Africa being China's first trade partner on the continent. And this video is going to be questioning at the end, if China and South Africa trade relation, how does it look like? Does South Africa has a trade surplus with China, or South Africa has a trade deficit with China? And because this has been one of the main contentious points between China and South Africa trade relation. If you remember last year, when there was the FOCAC in Beijing, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa went to China, and among the talking point was about how the effort that China should be making to help rebalance China and South Africa trade relation, because according to South Africa's number, South Africa was suffering from a trade deficit compared to China, which was trade surplus. But that was quite surprising to me, because when we do those coverage, when we report on those issues, we usually use China's numbers. And when we looked into China's number, we could see that South Africa was enjoying a trade surplus and not a trade deficit, just like not as like the authorities were saying. So having those two different numbers, and the difference were quite huge, really quite huge. I'm going to show you here a few numbers so you can have an idea and to understand how the difference was really immense to pay attention to. I'm going to show you other data that you can understand and see the magnitude and the differences of those numbers between South Africa and China. I'm going to start with those data here. First of all, for this year's data coming out of China. So we have those data here coming from China's custom service. The data are in Chinese. So basically, you have here, as I was saying, $6 trillion overall in terms of export and import. And here in terms of export, you have $3 trillion. In terms of import, you have $2 trillion. So which means like a 1.7 trillion surplus for China. So you have like now different region. You have with Europe, how much China traded with Europe is like $785 billion in terms of trade. You also have here with Southeast Asia. You also have here, for example, they counted Vietnam, they counted Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, and Australia. And you have also here England, Canada, and here below here you have like Africa. In terms of African numbers, like $295 billion in terms of trade between China and so and in Africa last year in 2024. And in the numbers you see, in terms of export, China exported in Africa 175 billion and imported 116 billion. Basically, China enjoyed a trade surplus compared to Africa overall. But here now they put South Africa, case of specific South Africa. The overall trade numbers for South Africa for China is like $52 billion. And how much China exported to South Africa, according to China number, China exported 21 billion and South Africa exported 30 billion. So according to China's number, South Africa is enjoying a $9 billion in trade surplus, which I believe when South Africa is going to release the report for 2024, the data are going to be different. So for last year, as I was saying before sharing this, for last year, the report was saying that yes, South Africa, China, South Africa number was like $55 billion, and that was the trade, the overall trade for 2023, just to give you a reference. But when you go to South Africa President SA News and you see what the president was saying, they say overall it was 692 billion, which is a rand, which is around 37 billion US dollars. So you had an $18 billion gap between South Africa's number and China's number. And of course, from South Africa's number, South Africa is suffering a trade deficit, which is China number is quite different. So where the difference can come from, I was speaking with different with different experts, and because myself I'm not a trade expert, but I was really trying to understand where the gap was coming from. Talking with Chinese, they did not understand much, and they were giving you some hint of saying that different countries have different ways to count the trade the trade data, so you can have discrepancies, which is quite common among countries. But what we see here between South Africa and China is quite huge because it's telling two different stories that we need to understand. So on South Africa's side, same thing. They say it was quite common, but it's also quite uncommon given the huge difference that is. But we see between the South Africa's number and China numbers. So from South Africa, there was some ideas that maybe China is counting minerals coming out of the DRC, coming out of Zambia, as coming because those minerals to go to China, they go through South Africa, and maybe China is counting those minerals as coming from South Africa, being South Africa's product to China, and China considered them as South Africa's product. But South Africa would be, but South Africa does not consider that. South Africa does consider that those products are not South Africans. They are they're just going through South Africa and they're going to China, which will make sense. Which basically would make sense because it means that it's not mine. It's just since I have my port here, the port of Durban, it's going to China. It's normal for that to be not counted by us. Then when you go now, try to look a bit different numbers to understand, yes, it means that from the DRC and Zambian number, we could also see similar trend. But when you see now the numbers coming out of the DRC, you realize that, for example, in minerals, because those are the bulk of what DRC is exporting to China through South Africa, you realize that for certain mining companies, they would list South Africa as the final destination of the export. Basically, they'll be saying that, let's say a big company being Glencore has an office in South Africa. They would say, we are selling this product to our office in South Africa, which basically for DRC does count between DRC and South Africa trade numbers. For DRC counts that South Africa as being the final destination and not China. But later on, if those companies in South Africa decide to sell those products, to export them to China, it will now for China be considered that, you know what, those products are coming from South Africa. We don't care what the country of origin is. We do assume that it was sold to South Africa, so it's coming from South Africa. And you see those differences because when you also see the trend numbers of the coming from DRC and South Africa, you also see I would say rather huge differences on what they're saying, on what it's showing. I'm gonna give you here some some references. I was trying to find the DRC trade numbers, but it was quite difficult. I did find a website that was providing those data. I'm not sure how much those data are really accurate, but I think it can give us an idea on DRC and South Africa trade numbers. So basically, let me show you this. So you see here you have DRC trade numbers. So DRC export, DRC top 10 DXC export from DRC. You're gonna see South Africa is listed say number 2 with $2.46 billion. It means that DRC has exported $2.46 billion of good to South Africa. The website is called Trade IMEX. It provides some data according from some country to give you an idea on how much the trade is looking like. So of course DRC is exporting much more natural resources, scope and everything. But this is what interesting us here. South Africa is considered like 2.6 billion. It was 2023. But when you go to South Africa revenue authority source, where they list the numbers of the trade for 2023, just to give you another reference, you realize that South Africa, even there, have also different numbers. And you look into those numbers here, we kind of understand that maybe we do have a different sets of stories that's happening here. Sorry, I'm trying to find a way to share the data so you can see. Okay, here we have it. So here we have the case of, this is basically South Africa trade numbers, cumulative bilateral trade by 2023. And this here we have import and export, and you have here South African export from January to December 2023, South African import. So we go to Africa here, we go to the DRC, here. It means that what South Africa is important from the DRC. We look the final number. The final number, it's telling us $2 billion. It means that DRC, 2 billion rand. It means that DRC exported 2 billion rands to South Africa. When you change the rand to USD, it's around, I think, if I don't mistake, 113 or 14 million dollars. So we can see the numbers coming from the DRC and South Africa are also different in terms of export and import. And those numbers are now, I think the gap is not reflected on China-Africa trade relation. So when I look those data, I was really trying to understand at the end to answer the question, does South Africa enjoy a trade surplus with China, or South Africa is suffering a trade deficit with China? This is really worth noting and mentioning, because it's been as I said earlier, it's been a contentious point between South Africa and China in the trade relation. South Africa wanted China to make much effort to try to rebalance this trade, the trade imbalance. But when you look at the numbers from China's custom, China is telling you different stories, it's telling you different narrative around that. So the question is how South Africa and China are going to address that, given that they do really have different stories and different numbers and different narrative to tell about the trade relation. I don't know if I'm not a trade expert. I would appreciate very much if among you there is someone with a trade expertise to kind of help us understand what's happening here. And if you have an idea, you can drop your comment, you can drop your suggestion in the comment to allow us to kind of understand what's happening and what's really going on here. So this is going to be my wrap up for this video, China Africa trade numbers. I realized that I was sharing the trade numbers about China in Chinese. Some might say, was it really what you were saying? And I think I'm gonna just be translating it so people kind of you can see that yes, I was not I wasn't making that up. And here you have those numbers. I'm gonna translate. I'm gonna use my browser translation to kind of show you what I was mentioning to English so you can see. So yes, as I was saying here, those are the numbers, and you have South Africa here below. So So basically, that's it. So I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait for other numbers, the detailed numbers about China Africa trade that's going to come maybe early next week. So we're gonna deep diving into China Africa trade numbers to see how much the picture has changed. And just to give you another reference, that was last year. That was 2023. Those numbers here for 2023, it was like the top five partners of China in Africa. It was South Africa, the DRC, Angola, Ghana, Egypt. We're gonna see if this year those numbers are going to be different. My bet is like a country like the DRC, Angola, and South Africa is going to remain in the top five. But what's going to happen to Egypt and Ghana is going also to be interesting to see. So for that, we're gonna have to wait for as I said, the much more decomposed and detailed numbers coming from China's custom. But this whole debate around South Africa and China trade numbers is really showing us the need for us to build that expertise to be able to be clear about the numbers of our trade. Because if we are not clear about those kind of issues, it's even more difficult to carry to carry a narrative that really makes sense. I cannot even imagine the difficulties between South Africa and China to negotiate all of these issues, knowing that they have two different set of data, two different ways of saying things, and two different narrative at the end that just make things much more difficult. Now, when you add the DRC in the equation, it's maybe difficult. Some might say that South Africa is playing his hand, or some South Africa is not really suffering a trade deficit. It's benefiting from a trade surplus. But either way, I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna see you next week, hopefully with much more data and numbers. So we can, as I said earlier, we can deep dive in those issues. So as I was saying in the beginning, my name is Geraud Neema, Africa editor of the China Global South. So every week we really try to bring you those stories to allow you to pay attention to things that you maybe did not pay attention to over the week in China Africa relation. And if you like what you saw, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Every time we're gonna drop a new video, you're gonna be notified. And if you like what you see, drop a comment, leave us your suggestion. And if you have a guest that you'd like us to have, because we also have the China in Africa interviews where we talk with different experts on different issues, let us know. We'd be happy to have them on the show. So see you next time for another video of China and Africa debate. Bye bye.